In today's video, we're going to make a great looking logo animation using Cinema 4D and After Effects. Let's go. Hey everybody, it's Nick here from Greyscalegorilla, and today we're going to be making this animation using Cinema 4D and After Effects. We're going to be making the logo, the glass look, all the refraction, the dynamics, and then we're going to export it to After Effects where we're going to add the final glow and really polish it up. If you are new to Cinema 4D, don't forget we have our Intro to Cinema 4D class, completely free. You can sign up down below. We'll try to link it up here on YouTube as well. All right, with that, let's head on in and let's start making this effect. All right, here we are in Cinema 4D, and if you have a logo of your own, go ahead and bring it in here to Cinema 4D, and if you don't, go ahead and grab a text object. Go up to the spline menu here, go to text, and you could just type in, your name or logo or whatever, just to follow along with this tutorial. So once you have your logo in, you're going to want to extrude it. So come on up here to this menu, click on it and go to extrude. And you want to drop in all of your objects into this extrude object. And it's going to make it 3D. Now, there's one other button you have to go turn on, and that's this one right here, hierarchical. Hope I said that right. It's a fun word to say. And that's just going to take all these paths and make this extruded 3D object. Once you have that, you have to start setting up your scene to get the refraction going. And the way we're going to build this is we're going to turn this logo into glass and then only see objects that are refracted through that glass. So how do we do that? Well, first, we need a little bit more rounding on our edges. This is going to help make our glass a little bit more realistic and give some other surfaces for lights to bounce off of. Now, I'm just moving around my viewport here with 1, 2, and 3. Sure, if you've ever used Cinema 4D, you probably know that, but just so you know, I'm moving around here with the camera. And next thing I'm going to do is go into our extrude, go to our caps, and go to fillet cap. Turn both of these on, and by default, it's a little strong. We could probably tone it down, maybe 2 radius. And then I'm going to add more steps because this is going to add more geometry to the edge, something like 3 or 5. And you know what? I might go 1 more, maybe to 3 radius, just to have it. Okay, so here's our logo. That's looking good. What do we have to do next? Well, let's go ahead and make our basic glass texture. Let's go to create, say new material, and drag this material onto our extrude object. Double click on our texture here to open up its material settings. Go ahead and turn off color. We won't need that at all. We do want transparency on, and we do want refraction. In fact, there's some refraction presets here. You can go to glass, or you could just type in something like 1.5 into your refraction, and that's just going to give a little bit more refraction as our lights kind of fall around the scene here. Okay. Leave all the rest on for now. And you also want to leave reflectance on as well. You could delete the default specular away from that object, but you should leave transparency and reflectance on for now. Okay, and so how we have our glass logo, and when we hit render, obviously nothing is there, and that's because we need something behind it in order for the light to transmit through this glass. So let's talk about setting that up, and then we'll set up the particle system to kind of build our lights. So let's just grab a sphere for now and move it behind our light, or move it behind our logo. I'm going to move it and reposition it and go to create new material. I'm going to drag this onto our sphere, double click on the material settings, turn off everything except for luminance. Now, luminance is going to light up that sphere, and when we hit render, you're going to see 2 things are happening. One is our glass logo is starting to show up a little bit, and we have this sphere in the background that is in our scene. Well, what we want is for all of these lights that come by. Let's go ahead and just duplicate our light here and move it around. What we want is for all of the lights that go by to illuminate our glass logo, but we don't want the lights visible in the scene, right? So how do we do that? Well, we can go to our spheres. Let's just go back to 1 for now, so keep it simple, and add a compositing tag. So the best way to do that is have your sphere selected, go to tags, and go to Cinema 4D tags and go to compositing tag and let go. Now you have a compositing tag on your sphere, and you have these checkboxes. The one you want is to turn off scene by camera and hit render, and bam, now we're getting somewhere. Now only the light is showing up, and only the refraction of the light is showing up. So this means we can now, make our scene here, and it's interacting with our logo, but it's not in the background. So we have it set up properly. Well, now you can go crazy. You can animate anything behind this logo, whether it's spheres or any shape you want, and just, you can go crazy at this point, and it will all reflect and refract in your logo however you want it. In the case of the example, what I set up was a really simple dynamic system with a particle sim where these spheres basically appeared on the scene and fell into a little box behind our logo and gave us this little dynamic animation. So let's set that up, and we could start to get this thing rendering. So how do you set that up? First thing you want to do is come up to simulate, go to particles, and add an emitter. Now, when you hit play, by default, this emitter is flinging particles out back, right? In Z space. You don't want that. So the first thing you want to do is grab your rotate tool, and you want to grab it and aim it down at the ground. Now I'm holding shift as well. And what that does is makes it turn in increments of 10. So it's just easier to go straight down. Okay, let's go to our emitter and go to our X size and make it bigger. We can make it as big as our logo. We can make our Y size a little bit larger as well. And I also want to extend our timeline just a bit. Something like 200 frames, I think, should be enough. And this will allow us to get more particles in the scene. Now, you're also seeing something else, which is somewhere around the middle of the render, the particles stop emitting. And that's a default setting in the emitter. You can change that really easily. Just go to where it says stop emission and set that to 200. And so now it will never stop emitting particles. And we could change that later down the road too. Next thing we want to do is emit spheres instead of these little particles. So how do you do that? Well, just drop the sphere in the emitter. And the next thing you want to do is come down here in your emitter settings and turn on show objects. You can also turn on render instances, but we're going to end up turning that back off anyway because of the texture we're going to add to our sphere. So let me show you what I mean by that. Right now, what we have are a bunch of white spheres, and we can take them and move them back and move them up. And when we look through our logo at them, it's not as interesting as it once was because they're all the same color, and it's kind of boring, right? So how do we make that multicolor effect that you see in the demo? And how do we add a little bit of variation to these spheres? Well, one thing we could do is just add different size spheres in our emitter. But you can also go to your emitter and go to your particle settings and come down here to scale. And you can change the overall scale of the objects. And more importantly, you could change the variation of the scale. So now you can see as these spheres are being made, some are big, some are small. Okay. So that covers the size of our spheres. But what can we do to make the colors different? Well, this is where we're going to use the variation shader. I'm going to open up luminance. I'm going to go to our texture here, open it up, come down to effects, and then under effects, you're going to see variation. Go ahead and click that. And by default, even if you just click render now, you're going to get different color spheres. And you can see it's a little bit pastel, but you are essentially getting different colors in each one of those particles. So that's interesting, but how do we control the color of each one of these spheres? We could turn on our scene by camera just for now, just so we could see our spheres better. And man, those are just not pleasing colors for me. To change it, go into your variation shader. You just click to go in here. And you have to do a couple things in here to set this up. First one is gradient blend. Turn that all the way up. And that means that this gradient will control our objects. And the only other thing you have to do is tell it how this gradient will control the objects? Well, my favorite setting is to come in here to the gradient mode and set it to replace. Okay. And then you turn down random color all the way. Now those three things will make this gradient exactly, it will basically take these spheres and say, hey, when you are born, pick a color from this gradient. So now it's just a matter of whatever colors you want in your scene, put them in here. We'll experiment with those in just a little bit. So now that we have that set up, let's set up our dynamic spheres and our little light cube that we're trying to build and get the dynamic simulation set up so that when these lights show up, it looks a little bit more interesting. So I'm gonna scale down our spheres just a little bit. And what we're gonna do is build a box for these spheres to interact with. So go up to your objects here, grab a cube. I'm gonna grab these little orange nubs on our cube and build basically a little cube wall that our spheres will live in. And I'm gonna make it a little thicker so our spheres have some room to bounce around. And then our emitter is gonna be at the top of this whole thing. It's basically gonna shoot spheres into this box. And we're gonna set up a dynamic simulation so that this box could catch all of these spheres for the lighting. So how do we do that? Let's go up to cube. Let's hit C to make our cube editable. And then I'm gonna go to this button over here. So what this allows us to do is choose polygons on our object. And all I wanna do is choose the top polygon and delete it, okay? This allows our spheres to kind of fling into the box. It allows us to see them a little bit better. And it also allows the dynamics to work a little bit easier. So how do we set up those dynamics? Well, let's go to our sphere, go to tags, go to simulation tags, rigid body. Now you do need the studio version of Cinema 4D to follow along with some of these features like the dynamics. But having dynamic spheres is that easy, right? Now you have these spheres and they're born and they have dynamics. They don't touch each other, no touching, and it explodes out. But now what we want them to do, we want them to live in this box. Okay. We don't want them to just fall through the box. We want them to like fall in like it's a box of cereal. So let's go to our cube, go to tags, go to simulation tags and say collider body. Well, that's kind of fun, but that's not what we want either. What's happening now is the spheres are not allowed to go into the box because of a default setting on this cube tag. This dynamics body just needs to be told what type of object it is. So if you go to your collision, you could go to shape, and instead of automatic, just make it a static mesh. Okay, so now what we have is our spheres are coming in and they're mostly falling in the box. Now, a couple of them are flinging around. We could solve that by making our spheres a little bit smaller. We could also go to our emitter and turn up the speed of our particles. This is gonna basically fling our particles more into the box and less out of the box, okay? So that's looking good. We might even be able to add a little bit more spheres to our simulation. Let's go ahead and add 20. And this is filling up our box. Now, we have an issue here. When we hit render, our logo is seeing the box and not the spheres. That's not what we want. So is there a way that we could keep the box in the scene, but not see it with the camera? Well, you remember we used that tag to do it. We could use the tag on our sphere to do the same thing and just say, don't show up in the camera, but it will still show up in refraction. Okay. Just like our spheres were. And so that's not what we want. And also it's off. So this does not solve it. Okay. It's still gray. The way to solve it is right here. These little traffic lights allow us to, if we turn them both red, it allows it to not be in the scene at all, but it allows the cube to still work as a dynamics object, but not to be seen or visible anywhere. And this is what we want. So now when we hit render, we have all this nice refraction with our logo. And if we go ahead into our compositing tag and turn off scene by camera again, we now get really cool refraction as these spheres fall past the logo, okay? And as they go down, it's gonna fill up and bounce around, and all these colors are gonna interact with our logo. So where do we go from here? Well, let's see if we have enough space for this all to fill up. I think what I ultimately want is our full logo to be full of color, and it mostly is. Okay, maybe we need to add a couple more particles, or really what I'm gonna do is just cheat our logo down a little bit, okay? Just so it's further down in the scene, maybe even scale it down a little bit, okay? And this is gonna allow the logo to fill up with color quicker. And so now we could just kind of find little frames throughout and say, well, that looks cool. And okay, that's cool. And I think we're getting close to where we could set up our render and do the rest in After Effects, where we could add these glows and all the other stuff. So what are the final steps we need to worry about here? Well, what you want to start to do is dial in the look and the colors of your spheres. So to get the look that is in the example, what I did is come up to our variation shader, and instead of this blue to white gradient, I open up this triangle and I went to load preset, and built into Cinema 4D should have these really cool gradient presets. So you could pick one of these, and the one I always pick, because it's so much fun looking, is this bright rainbow color. So now every one of these spheres that comes down has this crazy rainbow color to it. Now that we have that going, let's dial in our refraction a little bit and talk about blurry reflections and refractions. If we come into transparency, we could turn up our blurriness to, let's say, 20 and hit render, and you'll see a couple things start to happen. One is, wow, it takes a little longer to render, but you get these really beautiful smoked glass looks right inside of Cinema. And if you turn this down a little bit, maybe more like a 5% blur instead of 20, the colors start to blend together, and to me, it's a slightly more pleasing look. Now, there's other things you could do to make this look even nicer. You have these little edges here. One thing is to come into your render settings, and if you don't see your render settings up here, you could just click this button right there, and it'll open your render settings. And you can come up in here and say, okay, I'm going to use the physical render instead of the standard render, and that's going to clean up any reflection and refraction. And physical just ends up looking a lot smoother. Now, there's a couple more settings you might want to try in here. One of them is going into your physical settings, and instead of low, maybe using medium. And I'll leave it up to you, depending on the type of logo you're using, but you can see it's smoother the higher samples. But as always, when it comes to rendering, the higher the samples, the slower it goes. So that looks pretty good to me. Let's talk about making our spheres a little bit extra bright, which I think helps, especially early on, like in this part of the animation when it's a little bit dull and there's not enough light to really brighten this up. So one thing you could do is come into your texture here in your luminant texture, which has our variation shader, and just turn up the brightness. Now you can see it didn't do anything. We have to check on one more box here, which is this mix mode. And you have to go to multiply. And what this does is it pushes our colors a little bit past where they are, a little bit extra bright. And we could do a little bit of this in After Effects, but I think having that light data in Cinema will give us this extra bright color. And so as it goes, you'll see it'll start to fill up. We're just doing a little test render here. We're going to stop it at the end. Do a test render. See roughly what our final colors are, and give it a shot. Now, what I did right before I hit render for the final was I came into this variation shader and I just took out colors I didn't want. Sometimes these like really bright yellows and greens are just a little bit much. And I think I got rid of a lot of those, and I made it more about these like reddish, pinkish colors. And then I just kind of skipped past the greens. And to me, it was a little bit more, I just enjoy this color palette a little bit more. And what I would do is the same for you. You know, this is where you can bring your style into it. Or if you have a color palette for a brand you're working on, you could always use that as well. So that was the last step I did before I set up our final render. Now the rest is all done in After Effects, except for the camera. The camera was the last thing that I did. And so let's quickly animate a camera. let's just grab a camera and I'm going to turn it to 50 millimeter focal length. I'm going to turn it on in our scene, and I'm going to go to our final place here, a little bit further out in the scene. And I'm going to set position keyframes. Now, we go into more about animation in other videos and other training that we have on our site. But for now, I just turned off our scale and rotation, and we're just worried about position. I'm going to click. Actually, I'm going to do this slightly differently. I'm going to use just the Z parameter to animate. This is all I'm going to animate is this. And so I want to make sure my logo is centered. We're going to back out. And I got here by clicking on my camera, going to our coordinates. And let's go find our final resting part for our logo and set a keyframe at the very end. Boom. And then let's go all the way up to the beginning and zoom in on our logo. And let's get really close. This is going to be really cool to see all this light detail refracting through. And then don't forget to set another keyframe just by clicking on this button. Bam. Okay, so now you'll see the camera's moving away and our spheres are coming down. And you can stop here. I'm going to show you one more trick that I did. It's not necessary, but it does help make the camera move a little bit more natural. I want you to come into your timeline. You could find it up here in your window. Find your timeline, open it up. I want you to select your camera and then click on this button right here, F-curve mode. And in there, you're going to see some curves. You're actually going to see just one. And there's another button right here called frame selected. And that's going to put all of this data in our little timeline. I want you to select the second one and grab this little nub and hold down the command key and move it back. Okay. What this is going to do is it's going to speed up the beginning part of your animation and then ease into the final. So if we click this button again and frame it all up, or frame up all, I should say, and we take the second key or this first keyframe and move it down, you're now creating a really fast little camera move that starts up close and moves down over time. This might be a little too steep, but let's see what we got. And you can see it in the viewport, bam. And then you can always do a little test render and say, what does it look like right here? And if you're happy with the result, you're ready to render. So let's set up our render settings and then let's head up into After Effects and do our final animation. We're using our physical render. In this case, we use 1920 by 1080 settings. If you're just following along with a tutorial, you could do smaller resolution just to render it faster on your machine. I'm using 24 frames a second, and instead of the frame range as current frame, I'm going to all frames. That's all 200 frames. Next thing I have to do is go to my save icon. And remember, my render settings can be found right here. And your save icon, or your save settings, you just tell it where to render it. And in this case, I'm going to go to my media drive, Cinema 4D renders, and I can make a new folder called Refraction. Logo, I'm going to make it, call it TUT. And I'm going to copy that, bang, and then name those files the same. Okay, now go to Format, and instead of a TIFF, I'm going to use PNGs, 16-bit PNGs. And I also need to turn on my alpha channel. This is very important. I'm going to need that alpha channel to create any background effects or add any backgrounds later in After Effects. So I'm going to turn on alpha channel and turn on straight alpha. And now we are finally, my friends, ready to render. To render, I'm going to hit Shift R. And this is going to start to render this scene into my viewport. And you see it's rendering around. This first frame is absolutely blank because of the, there's no spheres in the scene yet. But you'll see even in just like frame 1 or 2, you'll start to see some light playing around on this. Now, if it's taking too long to render, you can turn down your physical render settings to something like low, but or scale down your image. But once you're ready to go, I will see you in After Effects where we will finish off this tutorial. All right, here we are in After Effects where we're going to finish this tutorial, add some compositing, gloss it all up. Let's do it. So to bring in your footage that you just rendered, once it's all rendered up, you can double click in your project window over here and go find what you just rendered. So I'm going to go to Cinema 4D renders and go to Refraction logo, and boom, I'm going to open it and bring it in. Okay, so once it's in, you can drag it into this little button right there, and that's going to make a composition the same size as your footage. So now you can move your your play marker through and see what it looks like. You can even turn up the resolution, and you can make a play blast by hitting your space bar, letting it render. You can also do a RAM preview by hitting 0 on your keyboard if you have an extended keyboard. So this is going to start from the beginning here. And we have all of our nice spheres coming down, all these awesome colors. And then they're going to settle into a place where it's a little bit more natural. All right. So we'll let this render here. It's 200 frames. And we're ready to watch it. Okay. So I'm digging it. I like the way the spheres are falling. I like the colors. And what we're going to do now is add that glow effect using After Effects. And we're also going to add a fade out effect at the very end. So it just fades to black, almost like a logo reveal at the beginning of a movie or something like that. So let's get started. I'm going to add a new solid and just put something behind this object. Now, you can totally change the look of this scene if you choose something really bright and have it like that. But I think, again, something a little darker will help the glows stand out. So I'm just going to pick black and put a black solid all the way in the back there. And then I'm going to start to layer in glow effects on top of this to make these little light sweeps a little bit more dramatic. So let's pick a frame where it's mostly dark, but these little bright areas, and start to add some glow above our logo. So let's go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. Let's find our Effects and Presets window. If it's not over here for you, you can go to Window and find it in here. And then once you find Effects and Presets, you can type in glow. Okay, so glow it looks really good. This is a really good glow. It's built into After Effects, and you just drag it on top of your adjustment layer. And you want to make sure your adjustment layer is above your 3D render. So now that we're here, there's a couple things we have to make sure are set up and turned on. One is to go back to your project tab and make sure that this is set to 32 bits. And the way to do that is if you hold down a command, you can come in here and just change it from 8, 16, 32. Make sure it's on 32 because that's going to make our glow effects look more realistic. So over in our effects controls window, you're going to see some settings for this glow. And so let's just crank up the glow intensity and you'll see that it gets brighter. You can also turn up the glow radius, which will make the radius around the glow bigger. That sounds obvious. And then the threshold. The threshold says, how bright does it have to be before I'm going to glow? And if you turn it all the way down, everything starts glowing. And as you turn it up, only the brightest highlights glow. Okay, so you could set it somewhere, where only these bright parts start glowing. And then let's set up our first glow. So in this case, I'm going to set something smaller, something like 10. And I'm going to turn our intensity way down, something like 1 or even less. Maybe I'll turn this up a little bit more, but this first one is going to be very subtle. Okay, and this is because what I'm building is a way to add multiple different glows so that we have small glows interacting with large glows. So how do we set that up? Well, now that we have one going on, we could go ahead and just duplicate it. Command D, make sure your glow is selected, Command D. Now your second glow, we're going to turn the radius up, and then we're going to turn the intensity way down. I mean, way down. And we're going to end up turning all of these intensities down because we don't need a lot of any of them. We just need a little bit of each. And what's interesting about glows, I'm playing around with these numbers to see which one looks the best. What's interesting about glows is it could get out of control very quickly, right? Glow intensity, if turned too far up, could just blow it all out. And that's just not interesting. Instead, we're going to layer these together with little glows. Let's go ahead and take our second glow, duplicate it. Now we have a third one. We can go even bigger, okay? Now we're starting to get these highlights. I'm going to turn down the threshold a little bit as well, and maybe even turn up the intensity. That might be a little too much, but let's find another frame and see where it's sitting. Holy moly, too much, right? So we just dialed it in for kind of a darker frame, and we got to a brighter frame, and I got to find my sunglasses. So how do we dial this back in? Well, let's start with 2. It looks like all of these are a little bit bright. Let's go to our second glow intensity. turn it down. Let's go to our third one, 0.1, turn it down. There's also something else we could do, which is if we like that look up front, okay, maybe we like this look here, this like overly bright look, and then we just tone it down over time. We could do that too, just by animating our adjustment layer. We could also animate the glow intensity, right? Really easy to animate in After Effects. So let's go ahead and start with transparency and see if we can't pull it off just by dimming down the transparency of our glow effect. So let's go to our adjustment layer. Let's hit T for transparency. It pulls up opacity, but that's how I remember it. T for transparency. I'm going to turn on a stopwatch here, and this is going to set our first keyframe. Now, over time, by the time we get here, I want it to be dimmed way back down. Something more like that feels good. Okay, so now what's cool is we have this ultra glowy look, neon style, and then it starts to fade out. So it makes our logo more readable, makes it more about what our name is here or our text is and less about the glow. And then as it slows down, it's just a natural dim, right? It's not too noticeable, it just kind of fades out. Okay, so that's good. Let's go ahead and add another little glow element. Let's go to Layer, New, Solid. And I've been doing this trick for too long, but what I do is I make a, you know why I do it? It looks good. And when it looks good, it looks good. Go ahead and grab a new solid. And I'm not even sure if I explained that correctly. I came up here to Layer, New, Solid. And then I said, I want this light blue color, somewhere around there. I want to make sure it's comp size, hit OK. Okay, I'm going to hit spacebar. I'm going to move my composition down a little bit. And I'm going to grab this tool. This is the ellipse tool. And just draw a mask around the top edge of this frame. Now, if you want to move your circle, you hit spacebar and you can move the circle around. And then when you let go, you can make the circle bigger or smaller or whatever. I'm going to just build this, okay? Now I'm going to hit F for feather and crank it up. Okay, I'm creating this nice little glow effect that's coming from the top of my scene. And I'm going to push in these little mask handles here. I hit V on my keyboard to get this little pen tool, or it's actually the little arrow tool. I'm going to hit T for transparency again and just dim it down. And I'm also going to scatter this glow. If you've ever tried to do this effect and then render it, you start to see banding. In fact, if you're watching this on YouTube, you might see banding right now, like where it's little layers of color coming out. Well, here's a little trick on how to get rid of that, because we're going to have to figure out how to get rid of it anyway. So just type in scatter into your effects window and get scatter. And crank it up until it goes away. You can see it introduces grain, but a little bit of grain is better than that banding effect, at least to me, okay? I'm going to add another duplicate layer of this blue and put it behind our logo. And then I'm going to take our mask and create just a little bed of color for our logo to live on. And I'm going to turn it way down. I mean, this is like, 10, 20% maybe. And you can see what we created now. It's just a little bit of atmosphere. And so just those two blue layers, let's turn them off. And you can see how just plain that is. You turn both of these on and you get these nice little glows. And it could really be subtle, okay? Doesn't have to be, all the way cranked up. Those little effects will help. Okay, so now I'm gonna do the same thing I did with the blue layers, but opposite. I want them to not be here, right here. I want the blue layers to be away, and then I want them to fade up by the time we get to around here. So how do we do that? Well, let's go to our transparency for this blue layer by hitting T. There it is. Let's set a keyframe for its current position. Let's go to the beginning and set it to 0. Let's also do the same with this bottom blue. Maybe it ends a little bit earlier, but it's currently at 10. Let's go back and set this to 0 as well. And so now I'm going to hit Shift 0. You can also do this if you come up to this corner and find your preview channel. You can hit this button and it'll play as well. If you don't see your preview, you can come up in your window and find it here as well. Okay, so now we have this dark logo area that then fades into more of a blue, and I like that. So let's do two more things. Let's add our fade out toward the end, and then let's add our final color correction, and we'll be good. So let's go layer, new, adjustment layer. This one goes all the way at the top. This is going to be our fade out. Now, there's other ways to do fade outs, including just animating a black layer, turning on and fading in. But this is how I like to do a fade out that looks a little bit more natural with lighting effects. So I'm going to go back up into our effects and presets window and grab a levels, L-E-V-E-O-S, bam. Add it to our adjustment layer. And somewhere around here, I want to see it start to get darker. And I'm going to just do a little transition. So in our levels, you're going to see the histogram timer here. This is going to make a keyframe for that histogram. To show it in the timeline, I want you to select your adjustment layer, hit U, and then everything animated will show up when you hit U like that. Okay, so here's our keyframe. And then over the next couple seconds, we want it to fade out into black. So let's just pull our timeline out a little bit. And then as we adjust this keyframe or this histogram, it will automatically set a keyframe wherever our timeline is. So I'm going to take this bright point and push it all the way down black into a more black part here. And you can see it kind of faded away. But that's not all I want it to do. I want to take the gain, this gamma slider here, and pinch it up. And what this does, and I'm going to turn down our resolution just so we could see this much quicker. As this renders, it's going to get darker, but the highlights are going to stay brighter longer. And to me, that's a much more realistic fade than just a regular all the way to black fade. And so experiment with this. Maybe the gamma doesn't have to go that bright, but something other than just a black fade is always more interesting to me. Look, like it almost gets to this like overly bright neon by the end. And so I'm going to set this to half resolution. We're going to do a quick render here, just every other frame to roughly see where we are. And that's looking good. I might smooth out that fading animation. Maybe just a little ease on those keyframes. It's a little sudden there at the end. But I would just highlight that second keyframe, go to keyframe assistant, say ease. And that should take care of that ending. Let's do one more adjustment layer, do a simple curves, and let's call it. Up in your effects presets, curves, bang, go to the kind of main frame, somewhere around here. And this is where you want to dial in the final look. So I'm going to turn this to full, and I'm going to look at it and say, okay, it's a little bright. I like how the highlights are bright, but I want to take the darker parts and add a little bit of contrast. So I'm just going to add a really simple S curve here. And I also love this trick. I love going to the blue channel in our curves and just pulling up on the blue channel. You can see if you overdo it too much, right? But a little bit of color in the black and then just pulling down the blue, to me, just eases in the color palette, makes the colors a little bit more in sync with how my palette is, at least. So here's the difference. That's a little too red and too hot for me. Here's with it on. See that subtle difference? But now what's really interesting to me just before we finish up here is looking at the original. This is what came out of the render. And this is all the other little subtle effects that we put on it. And we can animate this and turn our glow down. In fact, I'm looking at our glow and realizing I think it needs to be even more dim, right? So we could just turn our glow down a little bit more. And so all these final tweaks will really make a difference when it comes to your final animation. All right, speaking of final renders, let's get that done. I want you to learn this keyboard shortcut. I use it all the time to initiate your final render. And that is Shift Command \. And you can think of it like this, Shift Command ? It's the same key as the question mark. Just make sure you have that composition, that you're inside of that composition, Shift Command \, and it will automatically add that composition to your render. And now all you have to do is tell it where you want it to render to, and then pick your output module. In this case, we could do something like an Apple ProRes, or if you're trying to do archive, you could do an animation render, or if you're trying to go to the web, you could do something like an H.264, turn down the settings a little bit, and that'll be a lot smaller format. Once you have all this set up, you can click render, and you are ready to rock. Thanks again for watching, everybody. And don't forget, if you're new to Cinema 4D or just want to learn more about it, check out our free Intro to Cinema 4D series. I'm going to link it up down below and here on YouTube as well. Thousands of artists just like you are learning Cinema 4D and combining it with programs like After Effects to really learn more about motion design and also have a career doing this. That's what Greyscalegorilla is all about. I hope you go check it out. And with that, I hope to see you in another video really soon. Thanks again for watching. Bye-bye, everybody. Oh, I almost hit the like. Jeez. It's Nick from Greyscalegorilla.